So here we can notice a sense of overflow that occurs in A Tale for the Time Being. We start with a kind of straightforward translator's footnote of the term otaku as an obsessive fan or fanatic, a computer geek, a nerd. This turns into a more extended note in 12 that says it's also a formal way of saying you, which then overflows into a note in 16 that creates a kind of reflection on what's going on in the text. And in 17, there's an intrusion of the character Ruth, which could also be the translator Ruth or the author Ruth. She can't find references to the medical cafes or bedtown that now is referring to within her diary. And there's a direct question addressed from a perspective of the author, character, translator. Is she making this up? Okay, so now I'm going to make some things up, but hopefully to good purpose. Here, this idea of thinking about the margins of the text as a kind of shoreline led me to think about the Tale of Genji and probably the most shore-oriented chapter of it, which is the Akashi chapter. And here is a page image from the Tale of Genji, translated by Royal Tyler, also by the same press, the Penguin that issued A Tale for the Time Being. So here we might notice the compressed margins, a kind of concession to the commercial necessity of being able to produce the Tale of Genji in a way that conserves space but doesn't leave much room for the student or the scholar to actually add anything in the margins, a kind of closed text that creates this interesting problem of overflow in which the notes and poetry occupy the same space in the margins of the page. So here on this side we have the footnotes and then Genji's poem, which is not supposed to be relegated to the margins but is in fact a poem about the shore. Here my longing lies, over what new distances now that I have moved far along that other shore to a shore I never knew. So here, and please forgive me for this pun, we can think about the literary apparatus and the littoral apparatus of the coastal zone. This is just a rhetorical device to get you to remember what I'm talking about, to think about the literal and the littoral as bleeding into each other in an interesting way on the margins, that is, of the page, to think about it as an oceanic or littoral surface. Here, this might lead us to jump to a text that's also cited by A Tale for the Time Being, Yusano Akiko's Suzoro Goto, which also plays with the floating eye of female subjectivity. We might also notice that she's the translator of Genji Monogatari into modern Japanese. And here's where things get really weird. Okay, so here I was looking up the Akashi chapter in my copy of Yusano Akiko's chapter and flipped to find this piece of ephemera that had been collected within it. The story behind this text is that I got it from a graduate donation to the UC Berkeley Graduate Lounge Office by the daughter of a translator who had worked for the MIS and later at the Monterey Language Institute. So I had never opened this text. And this is just the Akashi chapter. It seemed interesting to think about what's going on with The Watermind by Inoue Takayuki. This is an album cover sticker that seems to participate in a manipulation of flesh, this kind of black-white aesthetic that might be resonant to think about. We might also notice that there's a kind of odd geographical proximity between Akashi, which is near Kobe, and the Kobe birthplace of Inoue Takayuki. I have no idea what's going on with this, but to think now of the text as something that accumulates debris in this ongoing gyre might be a way that we can think about how the text also deserves a kind of cinematic material celluloid reading. Okay, this led then to my turning to Edward Fowler's Rhetoric of Confession, which is also quoted within A Tale for the Time Being. Here's my copy of it, which was acquired at Moe's Books in Berkeley, circa 2010. And I flipped to where there seemed to be a receipt bookmarker, which is from somebody that purchased a CD, paying in cash $20.19 at Rose Records in 1634 East 53rd Street in Hyde Park. Chances are that given the small community of people that are buying the Rhetoric of Confession and selling it to Moe's Books, that somebody knows who bought this text, probably by 1 or 2 degrees of separation. But if we think about the kind of ephemeral debris that gets captured by the book, we can also find another kind of kansai image taken from this. I don't know why this person was reading or so interested in Chikamatsu Shuko, a Taisho author. Here there's a moment where there's a scene about Onatsu arriving late at a spa west of Osaka to find that Mashima has finished supper and taken to his bed, having despaired of her ever coming at all to meet up with their liaison. Okay, this made me think of a character whose name is not Onatsu, but Otatsu, who appears, I'm sorry, this is an image of Rose Records from Wabash. I couldn't find pictures of the Hyde Park location. It's a record store that no longer exists, such as the debris of, the movement of different media. Okay, so here's an image of the novel that I translated, Yoru ni Nageku, in which there's a character Otatsu and a reversal of this situation that occurs at an onsen that is at White Point Hot Springs, or White Point Radium Onsen, a now defunct pleasure resort and also famous sort place for extramarital liaisons among the Japanese American community in Los Angeles during this time. Something that was interesting about this is that here this kind of site was also a place for thinking about a kind of reminiscence, and here I'm going to quote, where the two lovers that are going to this resort see resemblances to the Hakusha Seisho, or the white sands and blue pines of that recall the Japanese landscape, right? If you go to this zone now, I mean, none of this exists anymore. It's all ruins. It was turned into a missile silo during the war, and then converted back into a park. But it has this kind of white cliffs and pine bluffs atmosphere that creates this white, dark aesthetic that might be thought of in terms of Notan or other aesthetics of that sort. Here we might make another leap through the kind of marginalia or association to think about Arthur Dow and the incorporation of this kind of light-dark aesthetic of pines and whiteness, or Notan, the idea of Hakusha Seisho as finding its interpretation within the works of others that are trying to incorporate within the technical apparatus of the book and book design, the idea that you would have motifs that are organized around this kind of play of a harsh contrast, black and white, on relative flat surfaces. Here is a text from somebody who would later become an art critic, poet, and literary critic, Sadakichi Hartman. You can see at your left this kind of image of an interesting compositional image that plays upon the idea of blackness and whiteness in a kind of foreshortened or flattened foreground that isolates these characters and seems to participate in the ongoing Boston book movement of Japanisme that operates under these principles of creating book images or ideas of composition that play on these ideas of light and shadow through Arthur Dow's citation of Notan in 1899, but even earlier in discussions that were occurring in book design in 1890. So here we can also think about what's going on with a decorative motif and think about what's going on in the margins or the shores of the text. It's interesting to think about how Sadakichi Hartman, a German-Japanese emigre, thinks about his relationship with Walt Whitman under these terms. These are the final lines, quote, "Nevertheless, what the old Quaker shortly before his death remarked about his intercourse with me, I could repeat in regard to Walt Whitman. When I summon up all the incidents of our acquaintance, it was perfectly satisfactory in every way. I would only add the most satisfactory one I ever had, without exception. It was calm, invigorating, softly flowing on like a summer day in the open fields or in the ocean." And our attention to marginalia, or the things that seem to be decorative objects at the feet of the text, might lead us to this kind of perplexing, I would argue, fetish image. Those that might be looking at this closely could imagine that the reed-like plant on the left might be a kind of stylized representation of the calamus plant. There might be a way of interpreting another kind of graft or stylized image of the morning glory that's attached with a knot below. Which says more, perhaps, about how satisfactory the intercourse between Sadakichi Hartman and Walt Whitman might have been, but also directs us to thinking about how we can think about the mixture of thinking about the open field or the ocean, the kind of topography or culture that's gestured by thinking about growth, but also about what might be occurring in the margins or the shorelines of the text that we read. So here, I just want to review what I've done as a kind of rapid movement through different kinds of things that are occurring on the shorelines or the margins or the technical apparatus of texts. Notice that I haven't done much kind of close reading of the text or the narratives themselves, but have been interested in what kind of stories the accumulation of the margins of text can provide us, the shorelines of text can provide us. We can return from this image of the calamus mixed with the morning glory to think about Arthur Dow. We can then move from this to thinking about how this might be represented within Boston book images of Japanisme incorporated into American book design. We can think about how that might resonate with Japanese publishing in Los Angeles during the 1920s. We can then think about the obsoleteness of Rose Records. We can think about how this might connect with a kind of Notan aesthetics of whiteness and blackness in the cover art or the stickers of Inoue Takayuki, and think then back to the wave movement that started this all. All of this is to suggest that by thinking about cultures of migration through the kind of odd temporality of what we might call the great garbage dump of the Pacific, this kind of gyre-like motion or spiral motion, we might be able to conduct a literary history that looks through the materialities of texts, the kind of arbitrariness of them, the randomness of them, the overvaluation of these ephemeral objects, but one that I hope can also blend into or overflow into a theoretical reassessment of how we can rethink the fields of Japanese and Japanese American studies. Thank you.
Thank you, Seiji, for your kind introduction. And thank you very much, Noe-Shimizu and the staff of Terasaki Center. I'm honored to be here, and I was singing in the rain this morning. I'd like to begin my presentation by showing you a very brief silent film from 1898. In 1898, a cinematographer from the Lumiere company placed his motion picture camera in an elevator of the Eiffel Tower and photographed a view from there. The film, Panoramic View During Ascension of the Eiffel Tower, consists of a single, almost 50-second shot and is an actual visual record of a modern technological experience. A view from an electrically operated fast machine that takes a rider to the top of a newly built metro tower. An early film historian, Arthur Lenning, claimed that the Lumiere films was, quote, nothing more than motion picture snapshots that were the recording of unadjusted, unarranged, untampered reality, end of quote. Many films that the Lumiere brothers produced between 1895 and 1910 were called by these historians actualité, or the actuality films, using footage of such current events, places, and things as French ceremonies, military parades, a president's visit to various locations, and travelogue footage of foreign countries. But if we look a little closer, we notice that this film creates an attraction of its own because of its careful composition. The film is basically divided into two planes. In the first, we see numerous metal bars that form the tower moving across the frame from the top to the bottom. In the second, the Palais du Trocadéro, which would be demolished for the Exposition Internationale in 1937 and replaced by the Palais de Chaillot. As each of these metal bars coming from different directions passes by, the Palais du Trocadéro comes in and out of sight, and gradually changes its position because of the change of the viewing positions of the camera. Eventually, the Seine also becomes visible at the bottom of the frame. As early as in 1979, Marshall Dotterbaum claimed, quote, there's little reason to continue to regard Lumiere films as naive photographic renderings of natural events which happen to occur before the camera, end quote. Dotterbaum's main argument is limited to the narrative structures of Lumiere films that, according to him, use, quote, ancillary actions to signal the beginning and the end of central action and thereby create a strong sense of closure, the end of quote. In addition to the narrative structure, we should also pay attention to the graphic awareness and compositional artificiality of Lumiere films. Film historian Komatsu Hiroshi argued that the Lumiere brothers, quote, probably adopted the significance of directionality of lines in paintings to their photographs, end of quote. because the dominant discourse of the time about ideal photography was to reproduce paintings. In their 1894 essay on photography, the Lumiere brothers opposed the prevailing view that photography could not be an art form because it represented nature as it is. They pointed to directionality of lines and shadows as the elements that would have artistic effects in photography. They argued, quote, composition and chiaroscuro should be satisfactory in order for a tableau to formulate a good impression, and claimed that their first priority is composition that would contain unity and balance. Louis Lumiere, according to Komatsu, brought such artistic inclination in photography to cinematography and graphically enhanced the directionality of lines by the movements of objects as a mass. When we juxtapose the film Panoramic View during ascension of the Eiffel Tower with the photography of Henri Rivière, for instance, we realize that the Lumiere brothers' films were not simply actualité, but should be located in the context of a pictorialist photography. Furthermore, I would argue that the Lumiere brothers used motion picture cameras to depict the world in the way that Japanese ukiyo-e woodblock plants did, by way of impressionist and post-impressionist painters and printmakers. Henri Rivière was also a printmaker. Heavily influenced by Katsushika Hokusai's woodblock prints, Rivière recorded the building of the Eiffel Tower with a series of 36 sketches from 1888 throughout the 1890s. The 36 views of the Eiffel Tower appeared as a lithograph in 1902. The work was based on Hokusai's popular serial of ukiyo-e prints, the 36 views of Mount Fuji. As Inaga Shigemi points out, Hokusai was well acquainted with the concept of perspective in Renaissance paintings. Instead of simply following the rule, Hokusai divided the space within the picture frame in order to exaggerate the contrast between the front and the back, gigantic versus tiny. Hokusai thus formulated a dramatic composition that directly connected two layers, the front and the back. Panoramic View during ascension of the Eiffel Tower emphasized the contrast between the first and the second planes much more than Hokusai and Rivière with its continuous movements. As each metal bar of the tower that places comes on and off screen as black shadows, the Palais du Trocadero appears and reappears within the frame. This game of hide and seek creates visual sensations. Japanism, the influence of Japanese art, culture, and aesthetics of European art, roughly between the 1860s and 1910s, had a significant impact on the Lumiere brothers and their films. In order to challenge the dominant mode of painting since the Renaissance era, Impressionist and post-impressionist painters referred to ukiyo-e prints in particular. In addition to the composition that reveal the artificiality of the technique of perspective in which different sizes of things existed in different planes, what these painters valued most in Japanese prints was the method of capturing moments and movements of the environment, instantaneity of brush strokes and dessin. Instantaneity, or l'instantanéité, was a word that Claude Monet used to describe his projects of capturing the landscape on site under the exterior light. Instantaneity is not equal to an instant. No matter how hard a painter may try, it is impossible to complete a painting in an instant. It takes a certain amount of time, and there are always delays. Impressionist and post-impressionist painters were conscious about this gap between a particular moment and the painting time. They understood that it was impossible for any human eyes and hands to extract an instant from time or a moment from moving objects. But they tried to represent by their hands the movement that they sensed with their eyes. In such a process, the skill of dessin became highly valued. The term instantaneity for Monet indicated the physicality of human beings. It is no surprise, therefore, that not many Impressionist painters admitted that they had been looking at photographs of stereoscopic views, even when stereoscopic views showing Paris boulevards flooded the market after 1859, but credited Japanese ukiyo-e woodblock prints instead. Amazement at how the ukiyo-e painters physically captured the movements of living things instantly, or the striking characteristic of their environments, is typically expressed in the following quote from Artistic Japan, a monthly illustrated journal of arts and industries, a representative magazine of Japanism published in 1889. Movement. It is everywhere in Japanese art, in architecture, in sculpture, in drawing. Only the great Buddha is quiescent, and he is so eternally. But at his feet, life multiplies itself and works in immoderate haste. A swarm of pygmies moves around him. One might say the same of a mad flight of insects dancing in a ray of sunlight round a lotus bloom. Japanese artists delight in liveliness. Stiffiness, heaviness, straight lines, logical and carefully set rules are their aversion. They throw themselves recklessly into amusement, only to stop when destitute of breath. Their means of expression, simplified as much as possible, lend themselves admirably to rendering hurried movements and spontaneity of action. As they are minute observers, so they reproduce actions that we take no cognizance of. By imitating the subjects of Impressionist paintings and applying their compositions to their films, the Lumiere brothers participated in the project of instantaneity. At the same time, a motion picture camera is technologically capable of extract instants in continuous movements, even if it cannot capture time and moving objects as themselves. The Lumiere films resulted in incorporating both the physical sense and the mechanical reproduction. In other words, they simultaneously presented instantaneity and instants. The connection of Lumiere films to Japanism was not limited to composition and instantaneity. On a more explicit level, there are Japan films in the Lumiere brothers' catalog. The motion picture camera had another important function: to capture, catalog, and display non-Western subjects, people, and sites in immediate and in actual manners. The Lumiere company sent out numerous cinematographers all over the world and collected a repertoire of films for screenings in France. World fairs were the perfect site to exhibit these films. The audience of cinema could view the spectacles of the world on the move while they did not need to move themselves at all. Newspapers of the period tended to cover the travels of the Lumiere cinematographers as an imperial conquest and marveled at how the entire world might soon be the conquest of the cinematograph Lumiere. There are 33 films photographed in Japan in the Lumiere catalog, which consists of 1,422 films. The Lumiere company sent two prominent cameramen to Japan, one after another, Constant Durel in 1897 and Gabriel Vale in 1898. No film was shot in other parts of Asia, except French Indochina. It may seem unusual to have 33 films shot in Japan. Japanism was most likely the reason for that number. A personal connection was another. The Lumiere brothers had a Japanese classmate at La Martiniere Institute in Lyon. His name was Inabata Katsutaro. Inabata was sent by the Kyoto prefecture to study the famous silk industry in Lyon. And after he went back to Japan, he became a big name in the rising silk industry there. And Inabata was the one who organized the very first exhibition of cinema in Japan in 1896. And you are going to see Inabata himself in another clip that I'm going to show you in a minute. Before and after visiting Japan, as did other Lumiere cinematographers, both Giraud and Weil photographed more official events in other countries. They photographed the coronation of the Russian Emperor Nikolai II, maneuvers of the German army, a party of the President of Mexico, and an official ceremony of the Cambodian king in French Indochina. This was the Lumiere company's strategy to make their product authorized and legitimate. But in Japan, they did not photograph political events, governmental officials, modernized urban areas, or anything similar. There were records that Giraud and Weil contacted the Japanese government and the Meiji Emperor, but they didn't push themselves to photograph them. Instead, what they captured appeared to be everyday scenes of Japan. For instance, there's a film titled Hepazan Familia. Inabata Katsutaro appears in this film. The title indicates this is a family meal. However, you may notice something is wrong, and